And welcome to our first day of Matilda. Wow, this is very exciting. So here you can see our character of Matilda, and if you don't know anything about this book, you can see that she's a little girl and she's got what on her lap here, a book, and behind the picture of me is lots of books. There's a whole stack of them. So we know that Matilda is a young girl and that what do you think she likes to do? She likes to read. Yeah, she likes to read. So let's go forward and start on the first chapter of Matilda. So here are a list of our chapters, and this is the contents page, and all the chapters are here. There's a lot of them, and if you have a look, it's quite a long book actually, Matilda, which we spoke about yesterday. We finished Fantastic Mr. Fox. The first chapter is called The Reader of Books. So like we said, that Matilda likes books. We could tell that from the front cover. So shall we get started? Let's get started. So, The Reader of Books. It's a funny thing about mothers and fathers. Even when their own child is the most disgusting little blister you could ever imagine, they still think he or she is wonderful. Some parents go further. They may become so blinded for their adoration, which means their love, that they manage to convince themselves their child has qualities of a genius. Well, there is nothing very wrong with this. It's the way of the world. It's only when parents begin telling us about their brilliance of their own revolting offspring that we start shouting, "Bring us a basin, we're gonna be sick." So what that means is that every single parent loves to talk about their own child, and they love to say, "Oh, my child's really good at this and this and this," as do I as a teacher. I love to talk about all of you wonderful lot and say how good you are at all the different things you're good at. School teachers suffer from a good deal of having to listen to this sort of twaddle from proud parents, but they usually get their own back when it comes to the time of writing the end of year reports. If I was a teacher, I would cook up some real scorchers for the children of doting parents. "Your son Maximilian," I would write, "is a total washout. I hope you have a family business you can push him into when he leaves school, because he sure as heck won't get a job anywhere else." Oh, that's not very nice, is it? Can you imagine Mrs. Smith or I ever writing anything like that about you lot? No, we would never write anything like that about you guys, because it's not very nice, is it? And also we don't believe that. If I was feeling lyrical that day, I might write, "It's a curious truth that grasshoppers have their hearing organs in the sides of their abdomen. Your daughter Vanessa, judging by what she has learnt, has no hearing organs at all." Also not very nice. So here what they're saying is that because parents like to talk about how amazing their children are, that teachers like to get their own back. Well, I'm sure that if Mr. Smith was here, that we would both disagree with that. That actually, that parents like to talk about how good their children are, and like I just said, that teachers also like to talk about how good the children are in their class. I might even delve deeper into natural history and say the periodic cedar spent 6 years as a grub underground, and then no more than 6 days as a free creature of sunlight and air. Your son Wilfred has spent 6 years as a grub in the school, and we are still waiting for him to emerge from his chrysalis. Ooh, comparing a child to a grub, well, that's not very nice. A particular poisonous little girl might sting me into saying, "Fiona has the same glacial beauty as an iceberg, but unlike the iceberg, she has absolutely nothing below the surface." Oh dear, that's not very nice. That means that she's not very clever. So, do you think teachers would ever say that about children? I don't think they would. That's not very nice, is it? I think you might enjoy writing your end of term reports for the stinkers in my class, but enough of that. We have to get on. So let's get started with our story. So that was just the introduction bit, saying that lots of parents like to talk and say lots of nice things about their children. Occasionally, one comes across a parent who takes the opposite line. So the opposite, the opposite of hot is cold. So the opposite of someone bragging about their child would be someone who shows no interest in their children whatsoever. And these are, of course, far worse than the doting parents. Mr. and Mrs. Greenwood were those two such parents. They had a son called Michael and a daughter called Matilda. And as parents looked upon Matilda in such a particular as nothing more than a scab. So a scab is when you get a cut or something. Scab is the thing that goes on top. A scab is something you have to put up with until it comes time when you can pick it off and flick it away. Mr. and Mrs. Woodward looked forward enormously to the time where they could pick their little daughter off and flick her away, preferably into the next country or even further than that. So now the first bit of the chapter we were talking about how parents like to talk about how good their children are, like all your parents will do. But Mr. and Mrs. Woodward are not like that. They're different. It says that they think Matilda is quite annoying, like a scab is, and they just want to get rid of her as soon as possible, which is not very nice and would probably make Matilda feel quite sad. It's bad enough when parents treat ordinary children as though they were scabs and bunions, but it becomes somehow a lot worse when the child in question is extraordinary, and by that I mean sensitive and brilliant. So what they're saying is that it's not very nice for any child, but if a child is brilliant, it's even worse because the parents don't recognise that. And Matilda is one of those children that she is brilliant. Matilda was both of these things, but above all, she was brilliant. Her mind was so nimble and she was so quick to learn that her ability should have been obvious to even the most half-witted of parents. That means that it should be obvious to anybody how brilliant Matilda was, but it wasn't to her parents. But Mr. and Mrs. Woodworm were both so gormless and so wrapped up in their own silly little lives that they failed to notice anything unusual about their daughter. To tell the truth, they wouldn't have noticed if she'd crawled into the house with a broken leg. So, Mr. and Mrs. Woodward, what do you think? Are they good parents? Yes? Not sure? Or no? I would say that they're not great parents because it says there, if I get my highlighter, that they would not have noticed. I doubt they would have noticed, which they wouldn't have noticed if she'd crawl into the house with a broken leg, which means even if she came back one day with a broken leg, they wouldn't have noticed, which means that they don't really care that much about her, which is a shame. Matilda's brother Michael was a perfectly normal boy, but the sister, as I said, was something to make your eyes pop. By the age of 1.5, her speech was perfect, and she knew as many words as most grown-ups. Now, at the age of 1.5, you're a toddler, and you'd be able to speak, but you wouldn't be able to speak in full sentences. You'd be able to say some words. You'd be able to say things, and people would be able to understand you a little bit. But some children don't start speaking until the age of 2. So by the age of 1.5, it was amazing that she could talk as well as most grown-ups. So she really is very clever, very intelligent and brilliant, like they said. The parents, instead of applauding her, means instead of clapping and praising her, they called her a nosy chatterbox and told her sharply that small girls should be seen and not heard. By the time she was 3, so that's when you start nursery, Matilda had taught herself to read by studying newspapers and magazines that lay around the house. So normally when you're in school at 3 years old, you learn your phonics sounds. So you learn a, b, k, like at. You would learn things like that. But you normally wouldn't learn to read properly until you're 4. And then you would start to be able to read properly when you're 4, or some people 5. So when she's 3, she can read newspapers, which is what adults read. So again, really, really advanced. At the age of 4, she could read as fast and as well as she naturally began a hankering after books, which means she really wants to start reading books. Not just little books though, books like adults read. The only book in the whole of this enlightened household was something called Easy Cooking, belonging to her mother, and she had read this from cover to cover. She had learned all the recipes off by heart, and she decided she wanted to read something more interesting. So this girl Matilda, she is very, very clever. She is very advanced. She is reading a whole cookery book, and she's read it so many times she's learned it off by heart. So now she wants to read something else more interesting. Now, there's no more books in her house. So, where would you get more books from? Now, where could she get more books from? You could get books from school. You could get books from a shop. It doesn't say that she goes to school, so maybe she can't get books from school. From a shop, if her parents don't really care about her, they're going to buy her a book? No. Can you think of any other places you can get books from? Oh, well, let's see. And let's see if Matilda manages to think of somewhere she can get a book from. Daddy, she said, do you think you could buy me a book? Oh, it's just what we said. A book, he said. What do you want a flaming book for? To read, Daddy. What's wrong with the telly, for heaven's sake? You've got a lovely telly with a 12-inch screen. Now you come asking for a book. You're getting spoilt, my girl. Nearly every weekend afternoon, Matilda was left all alone in her house. Ooh, which is not very good, is it? Her brother, who was 5 years older than her, he went to school. Her father went to work and her mother went out playing bingo in the town 8 miles away. So Matilda is 4 years old. That's what it said in the previous page. And she is being left alone all by herself. Now, that wouldn't usually happen. You wouldn't leave 4-year-olds by themselves. They're way too young. Things could happen and it's dangerous. So she's left all by herself, which is not nice. So it really does show that her parents really don't care about her. Her brother, who's 5 years older, so Matilda's 4 and her brother's 5, which makes him 9. So he goes to school, but she doesn't go to school yet. So I wonder what she does all by herself. Mrs. Woodward was hooked on bingo and she played it 5 afternoons a week. On the afternoon of the day when her father had refused to buy her a book, Matilda set out all by herself to walk to the public library in the village. Ooh, the library. Did you think of that idea? Libraries are really good at getting books and they're normally free to get books unless you borrow it for too long and then you might have to pay if it's a little bit overdue or late. When she had arrived, she introduced herself to the librarian, Mrs. Phelps. She asked if she might sit for a while and read a book. Mrs. Phelps was slightly taken aback at the arrival of such a tiny girl, unaccompanied by a parent, which means she came on her own. Nevertheless, she told her she was very welcome. Now, Mrs. Phelps is sat in the library and a little girl, the age of 4 years old, comes in. She's all by herself. It says here that she was taken aback. What do you think that means? How do you think Mrs. Phelps is feeling to see a little girl wandering in on her own? Do you think she's shocked? Surprised? Astonished? Well, I wonder if you can think of any other words. I would say she's all those words. I would say she would be quite shocked to see a child on her own. Where are the children's books, please? Matilda asked. They're over there on those lower shelves, Mrs. Phelps told her. Would you like me to help you find a nice one with lots of pictures in it? No, thank you, Matilda said. I'm sure I can manage. So Matilda, at the age of 4, she seems to be able to do quite a lot of things for herself, which means she's very independent. And why do you think that is? Well, I would think it's because no one's ever done anything for her, so she's had to learn to do those things for herself. From then on, every afternoon, as soon as her mother had left for bingo, Matilda would toddle down to the library. The walk only took 10 minutes, and this allowed her 2 glorious hours of sitting quietly by herself in a cosy corner, devouring one book after another, which means that when she says devouring, she's loving reading, so she's really into each book. She reads one book after another. She is really enjoying it. When she had read every single book in the children's book in the place, she started wandering around in search of something else. Mrs. Phelps, who had been watching her with fascination for a few weeks now, got up from her desk and went over. "Can I help you, Matilda?" she asked. "I'm wondering what to read next," Matilda said. "You've finished all the children's books?" "You mean you've looked at all the pictures?" "Yes, but I've read all the books as well." Mrs. Phelps looked down at Matilda from a great height, and Matilda looked right back up at her. "I thought some were very poor," Matilda said, "but others were lovely. I liked The Secret Garden best of all. It was full of mystery." So, at the age of 4, she has read all of the children's books, not just looked at the pictures. She's actually read them, and she understands them because she says the book The Secret Garden is full of mystery. The mystery of the room behind the closed door, and the mystery of the garden behind the big wall. Mrs. Phelps was stunned. "Exactly how old are you, Matilda?" she asked. 4 years and 3 months, Matilda said. Mrs. Phelps was more stunned than ever, but she had no sense not to show it. "What sort of book would you like to read?" she asked. Matilda said, "I would like a really good one that grown-ups read, a famous one. I don't know any names." Mrs. Phelps looked along the shelves, taking her time. She didn't quite know what to bring out. How, she asked herself, does one choose a famous grown-up book for a 4-year-old girl? Her first thought was to pick a young teenager's romance, the kind written for 15-year-old girls, but for some reason she found herself instinctively walking past that particular shelf. "Try this," she said at last. "It's famous and very good. If it's too long for you, just let me know and I'll find you something a bit shorter and a bit easier." "Great Expectations," Matilda read, by Charles Dickens. "I'd love to try it." "I must be mad," thought Mrs. Phelps, told herself, but to Matilda she says, "Of course you may try it." So she's thinking in her head, wow, I've just given a book for a lot older child or a teenager to a 4-year-old. I must be mad. But she doesn't tell Matilda that because she knows that she's clever. Over the next afternoon, Mrs. Phelps could hardly take her eyes from the small girl sitting for hour after hour in the big armchair at the far end of the room with the book on her lap. It was necessary to rest it on her lap because it was too heavy for her to hold up. So Matilda spends every afternoon in the library and she is reading the story of Great Expectations. Which meant she had to sit leaning forward in order to read. And the strangest sight as it was, this tiny dark-haired person sitting there with her feet nowhere near touching the floor, totally absorbed in the wonderful adventures of Pip and old Mrs. Havisham and her cobweb house and the spell of magic that Dickens, who's the author, the great storyteller, had woven with his words. The only movement from the reader was lifting up a hand every now and again to turn the page, and Mrs. Phelps always felt sad when it came time for her to cross the floor and said, "It's 10 to 5, Matilda." During the first week of Matilda's visits, Mrs. Phelps said to her, "Does your mother walk you down here every day and then take you home?" "My mother goes to Aylesbury every afternoon to play bingo," Matilda had said. "She doesn't know I come here." "But that's not surely right," Mrs. Phelps said. "I think you better ask her." "I'd rather not," said Matilda. "She doesn't encourage reading books, nor does my father." "But what do they expect you to do every afternoon in an empty house?" "Just mooch around and watch the telly." "Oh, I see." "She doesn't really care what I do," Matilda said a little sadly. So you can see that Mrs. Phelps and Matilda are having a chat, and that it does say there that Matilda says that she doesn't think her parents care what she do. So how do you think she feels? It does say she said a little sadly, but I think we can come up with a better word than that. How do you think she feels? Do you think she feels miserable? Left out? Yeah. I think she doesn't feel very happy about the situation at all. So that's why she's trying to do something to make herself feel better by going to the library and doing something she likes to do. Mrs. Phelps was concerned about the child's safety on the walk through a fairly busy village, High Street, and crossing the road, but she decided not to interfere. Within a week, Matilda had finished Great Expectations, which in that edition contained 411 pages, which is even longer than Matilda, the book. I loved it, she said to Mrs. Phelps. Has Dickens written any others? A great number, said the astounded Mrs. Phelps. Shall I choose you another? Over the next 6 months. So what do you think Matilda's going to do over the next 6 months? Do you think she's going to keep coming back to the library and choosing more books? I hope so. Over the next 6 months, she kept a watchful and compassionate eye. Matilda read the following books. So these are all the books here she read. There's a very, very, very long list of them. And most of these books are meant for adults. So Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist, which is a fabulous book by Charles Dickens, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, another fabulous book, but again, it's made for adults. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, made for adults. Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, Gone to the Earth by Mary Webb, Kim and the Rudyard by Rudyard Kipling. You can see, look at all this list of books. It's a massive long list of books. So in 6 months she read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. She read 14 books in 6 months. That is quite a lot of books. So she must read. With that, in 6 months, she must read more than 1 a month. Well, she must read more than 2 a month, because 2 times 6 is 12. So some months she might read 2, and some months she might read 3, which I would say I would struggle to read 3 books a month. So she's a very clever little girl. It was a formidable list, and by now Mrs. Phelps was filled with wonder and excitement. But it was probably a good thing she didn't allow herself to be completely carried away by it all. Almost everyone else witnessing the achievements of this small child would have been tempted to make a great fuss and show the news all over the village and beyond, but not so Mrs. Phelps. She was someone who minded her own business and had long since discovered it was seldom worthwhile to interfere with other people's children. So what it says is other people might have contacted the news and told other people, but Mrs. Phelps thought, well, it's best not to interfere. We'll just let Matilda do what she wants to do. Mr. Hemingway said lots of things I don't understand, Matilda said to her. So one of the authors is Ernest Hemingway. So she's asking. She didn't understand quite a lot of the things, especially about men and women, but I loved it all the same. The way in which he tells it, I feel I'm right there on the spot watching it all happen. A fine writer will always make you feel like that, Mrs. Phelps said, and don't worry about the bits you can't understand. Sit back and allow the words to wash around you like music. I will. Did you know, Mrs. Phelps said, that public libraries like this allow you to borrow books and take them home? I didn't know that, Matilda said. Could I do that? Of course, said Mrs. Phelps. When you have chosen a book you want, bring it to me so I can make a note of it, and it's yours for 2 weeks. You can take more than one home if you wish. So Mrs. Phelps is really helping Matilda. Not only is she letting her come into the library and read books, but she's going to let her take books home, which most libraries do let you do. And she's saying she can take more than one book home, which will be really nice for Matilda. She'll get to read at home as well. Ooh, but what could the problem be about her reading at home? So she'll have the books at home. Do you think her parents might spot the books? They might wonder where they've come from. Let's keep that on our head and see what happens on the next page. From then on, Matilda would visit the library only once a week in order to take out new books and return the old ones. Her own small bedroom now became her reading room, and there she would sit and read almost every afternoon, often with a mug of hot chocolate beside her. She was not quite tall enough to reach things around the kitchen, but she kept a small box in the outhouse, which she brought in and stood on it in order to get what she wanted. Mostly it was hot chocolate that she made, warming the milk in a saucepan on the stove before mixing it. Occasionally she made Bovril or Ovaltine, they're both warm drinks as well. It was pleasant to take a hot drink up to her room and have it beside her as she sat in her silent room reading in the empty house in the afternoons. The books transported her, which means they took her to new worlds, introduced her to amazing people who lived exciting lives. She went on olden day sailing ships with Joseph Conrad. She went to Africa with Ernest Hemingway and to India with Rudyard Kipling. She travelled all over the world while sitting in her little room in an English village. So when you read a book, like when we're reading this book, it can sometimes take you to a different place. It can transport you, just like when you're watching a movie. That happens to me when I watch movies. I feel like I'm in the place and I'm witnessing it. I'm experiencing it all. So that was the end of our first chapter of Matilda. So in our first chapter of Matilda, we have met quite a few characters. We've met 5 characters. We've met the main character, who is Matilda. We've met her brother, who's 9 years old, and Matilda's 4, her brother's 9. We've met her 2 parents, Mr. and Mrs. Woodward. Now, her family members, we don't know much about them yet. And we've also met the librarian, Mrs. Phelps. We've met 5 characters. We don't know that much about the other 4 characters, especially the 3 family members. We know Mrs. Phelps is a kind lady and that she doesn't really want to interfere, but she is kind because she helps Matilda. And we know quite a lot about Matilda already. We know that she's 4 years and 3 months, yep. We know that she likes to read. We know that she feels very sad and upset because she feels like her parents don't really care or don't have any interest in her. And she loves to read, and she's very independent because she can do a lot of things by herself. Things like going into the kitchen and making a hot drink. Now, at the age of 4, you would not go into the kitchen by yourself and use the stove or the kettle or anything like that, and yet Matilda can do all those things. So she really is a brilliant girl, this Matilda. I wonder what's going to happen in the next chapter. I think in the next chapter we might start to meet some of the other characters, maybe some of her family. We're going to maybe learn more about her brother and her parents. So I hope you enjoyed today's chapter, and I'll see you tomorrow on Wednesday for the next chapter, chapter number 2 of Matilda. Bye for now.